It was the 23rd of June, 1972. A procession like no other swept through the narrow streets of a small European town, its cobblestones echoing with prayers, incense, and chants. At its center walked Bishop Adrian Keller, respected, devout, and revered as a man of unshakable faith. Clad in ceremonial robes and his gold-trimmed mitre, he carried not only the sacred relic of Saint Eustace, but also the hopes of people bound by tradition and belief. No one imagined that by sundown, the bishop would vanish without a trace, leaving behind silence, confusion, and a haunting mystery that would remain unsolved for 2 long decades. What followed was a series of events so unsettling, so layered with spiritual symbolism, that even the most rational mind struggled to explain it. There was no sign of struggle, no witnesses to a possible crime, no ransom note, no farewell. One moment, the bishop was surrounded by hundreds of parishioners. The next, he was simply gone, as if heaven itself had claimed him. Yet something about his disappearance didn't sit right. Rumors began to circulate. Some claimed it was divine intervention, others whispered a betrayal within the church, and some even feared it was an ancient curse tied to the relic he had carried. Years passed. The church tried to move on. The people tried to forget, but questions remained. Every Christmas and Easter, parishioners would light a candle for the lost bishop, praying for answers. His image became etched in a local folklore. Children grew up hearing tales of the bishop who walked into the light and never returned. And then, just when the world had given up hope, something resurfaced, something that shattered the silence and reopened every wound. His mitre, found downstream, tangled in reeds along the river's edge, exactly 20 years later to the day. But how did it get there? Why was it perfectly preserved? And what did it mean that it reappeared on the very same date of his disappearance? Investigators were baffled. Clergy wept. Believers called it sign. The discovery reignited a fire that had never truly gone out, leading to a renewed investigation, and even more shocking revelations than anyone expected. What was uncovered in the weeks that followed not only shook the foundations of the local diocese, but left an imprint on the hearts of all who heard the bishop's story. Tonight, we return to the beginning, to that summer day in 1972, to the silent cries and forgotten confessions. As we retrace the bishop's final steps, piece by piece, you'll witness how faith, mystery, and human frailty collided in one of the most gripping spiritual enigmas of the last century. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll begin to see why some believe he never truly left. The morning of the procession had begun with an unusual stillness in the air, as though the town itself sensed something sacred, or sinister, was about to unfold. Bishop Adrian Keller, who had served the community for over 3 decades, awoke in silent prayer, as he always did. But this day was different. He had been having dreams, cryptic and heavy with symbolism, of rivers splitting and eyes watching from the trees. He told no one. He simply placed his hands on the relic of Saint Eustace, kissed it reverently, and began preparing for the day's spiritual celebration. The entire town had turned out for the event. Mothers held their children close. Elderly villagers leaned from windows to catch a glimpse of the sacred icon, and the man they saw as more than just a bishop. He was their moral compass, their living guardian. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Every step Bishop Keller took echoed with authority and humility, but also, though no one could have known at the time, a sense of finality. It was as if he was walking not toward the church, but toward something far beyond human reach. Eyewitnesses would later give fragmented, conflicting accounts of the exact moment things changed. Some claimed the sky dimmed for a brief second, though the sun remained shining. Others swore they saw the bishop pause at the foot of the old stone bridge and look toward the river with an expression they couldn't quite describe, equal parts peace and dread. And then, he was no longer there. In the crowd's movement, hymns, and incense smoke, he had simply vanished. His staff fell to the ground. The relic was found by a child, cradled gently in a bed of wildflowers. But the bishop himself had ceased to be. Panic rippled through the town. The choir stopped singing. Clergy searched frantically, while the people clung to one another in stunned confusion. Hours became days. The river was dredged, the nearby woods combed, the entire region alerted. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no clues, not even footprints leading away from the site. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by a presence unseen, unspoken. Silence became the town's new hymn. Fear became its new sermon. The church tried to suppress the more supernatural theories. But whispers are hard to silence when grief gives birth to myth. Some parishioners insisted he had been taken by angels, chosen like Enoch or Elijah. Others were convinced it was punishment, divine or demonic, for secrets the bishop may have carried. But amidst the confusion, one detail stood out. Before vanishing, Bishop Keller had been heard uttering a phrase in Latin, words later translated as "the shepherd must find the gate before nightfall." No one understood it then, but it would return, like an echo from the past, exactly 20 years later. For the next 2 decades, the disappearance of Bishop Keller cast a long shadow over the community. Children born after the incident grew up hearing stories of the bishop who walked into light, told with the same reverence one would reserve for saints or martyrs. His photograph hung on the chapel wall, surrounded by candles that never went out. Yet behind the devotion, a darker undercurrent stirred, of questions unanswered, truths buried too deep, and the uncomfortable suspicion that perhaps the bishop's fate had been more human than holy. Behind closed doors, church officials had struggled to contain the more controversial threads of the investigation. A sealed journal had been found in the bishop's private study, containing cryptic entries written in a mix of Latin and Old German. One line repeated throughout chilled those who could decipher it. "The gate is sealed by blood not shed." Linguists were brought in discreetly, and eventually, the diary was locked away deep within the archives. No explanation was offered to the public. Only silence. But silence is never complete in matters of faith and memory. 20 years later, on the exact date of his disappearance, a group of local teenagers hiking by the river stumbled upon something strange. Tucked between rocks, almost glowing in the morning sun, was an object wrapped in faded ecclesiastical cloth. When authorities arrived and carefully unwrapped it, they froze. It was the bishop's mitre, intact, ornate, and inexplicably dry. And beneath it, carved into the stone, was the same Latin phrase he had uttered before vanishing: "The shepherd must find the gate before nightfall." The news spread like wildfire. The town, which had tried so hard to move on, now found itself plunged back into the vortex of mystery, grief, and longing. The riverbank where the mitre was found became a shrine overnight. Thousands came, leaving flowers, prayers, and candles, hoping for closure, or at least a glimpse of truth. Theories once dismissed as fantasy returned with force. Had he been abducted? Had he found a passage, literal or spiritual, to another realm? Or had someone hidden him? And why? Amid the media storm and renewed investigations, one voice stood out, that of Father Matthias, a young seminarian who had served as Bishop Keller's assistant during the fateful procession. Now in his 40s, he had remained silent all these years. But with the mitre's reappearance, he broke his vow and offered a single, chilling statement. He told me the river wasn't just water, it was memory. And memory never forgets what truth it carries. Those words would soon lead investigators down a path far darker than anyone was prepared to follow. The statement from Father Matthias became the turning point in the new investigation. His words weren't taken lightly. They stirred something deep, not only among the faithful, but within the very core of those who had long dismissed the bishop's disappearance as a cold case. A new team was assembled, this time including not just theologians and local authorities, but forensic historians, linguists, and even a psychologist specializing in religious trauma. They weren't just trying to find out where the bishop had gone. They were trying to understand why his mitre had returned, untouched by time, untouched by nature, and marked with a message that no one could ignore. The first breakthrough came when an old wooden box was recovered from a disused storage room in the monastery's lower chambers. It had belonged to Bishop Keller and was believed lost in the original investigation. Inside were several audio tapes, their labels faded but still legible. One of them, dated just 2 nights before the bishop vanished, contained a recording of his voice. The tone was subdued, contemplative. He spoke of a doorway hidden beneath the weight of guilt, and warned that the river watches and waits, and it remembers every betrayal committed beside its banks. The words chilled everyone who listened. Local legends, once thought to be mere folklore, gained new relevance. The town had always feared the river, not for its depth or current, but for the stories whispered from one generation to the next. Centuries ago, it had been the site of secret trials, quiet executions, and unmarked burials. One tale even spoke of a priest who had cursed the water after being condemned for heresy, declaring that the river would one day claim the crown of righteousness as penance for the blood not shed. Most had laughed at these tales. Now, they weren't laughing. Meanwhile, forensic tests on the Mitre revealed something astonishing. Though untouched by water damage, it contained microscopic traces of a rare plant species found only deep in the forest bordering the river. The plant had not grown near the town for over 50 years. This led the investigation team into the dense woods, retracing the path of the river upstream, searching not only for botanical clues, but for remnants of the monastery's forgotten past. What they found was the beginning of a revelation far greater than expected. Buried beneath a collapsed stone outpost, long hidden by overgrowth, lay the remains of a chapel, and within its fractured walls, a sealed wooden door reinforced with iron bands. On it, painted in the same faded gold as the bishop's mitre, was a symbol known only to scholars of the ancient church, the mark of the Custodes Veritatis, the guardians of truth. Few knew the order had ever existed. Fewer still believed it had anything to do with Keller. But the seal, the timing, and the bishop's final words suggested otherwise. The discovery of the sealed chapel ignited both excitement and unease. What lay behind the door was uncertain, but what it represented was far more dangerous. A possible secret order within the church, one with the power to conceal truths for generations. The door was left untouched at first, as debates swirled among the clergy and scholars about whether it should even be opened. Some warned of spiritual consequences. Others feared what political ramifications it might provoke. But the weight of 2 decades of silence pushed them forward. And when the lock finally gave way, what they found inside was beyond comprehension. The room behind the door was small and circular, lined with shelves holding manuscripts wrapped in leather, candle stubs, and relics whose authenticity had yet to be confirmed. But in the center, placed on an altar of stone, was an object no one had expected, a second mitre, identical in shape and design to Bishop Keller's, but blackened and cracked as though scorched. And beside it, a book bearing his name, Adrianus Keller, in Testimonio Temporis, a testimony of time. The bishop had left a record, or perhaps the confession. Its pages, delicate and laced with cryptic ink symbols, revealed a man tormented by something he had witnessed during his early priesthood. Keller described a ritual, a procession not of worship, but of punishment, a gathering of clergy in the dead of night, robed in silence, surrounding a boy accused of heresy. What haunted the bishop most wasn't what happened during that ritual, but what didn't happen. He wrote of standing frozen as others demanded blood, and of how the boy had stared at him, not with fear, but with forgiveness. That boy, according to Keller's own words, had disappeared into the river without a sound. The bishop had never forgiven himself. He had carried that moment like a shadow, believing the river had marked him from that night forward. Every year, he returned to the site, and in his final entry, he wrote something that now resonated with terrifying clarity. I walk toward my judgment not to escape it, but to accept it, for no man of God should be crowned unless he has first knelt in the current of truth. Many believed he had willingly disappeared, vanished into the arms of the same river that had taken the boy. But there was still one question. Why did the river return his mitre? Investigators continued their search, now deeper than ever into theological history and Keller's own lineage. A scholar unearthed a baptismal record from a village hundreds of miles away, dated 40 years before the bishop's rise to office. It contained a name that matched the boy from Keller's testimony. But the final shock came when they translated the last line of Keller's journal, written in invisible ink, only revealed through heat. He was my brother. The bishop had not simply been a witness. He had been tied by blood and bound by silence. The revelation that the boy from Keller's haunting memory was his own brother sent tremors through the already fragile foundation of the case. Suddenly, The bishop's entire life appeared to be built not only on faith, but on grief, grief buried so deep it had become a form of penitence. Scholars began to revisit his sermons, journals, and letters, uncovering veiled references to duality, sacrifice, and rivers as mirrors of divine justice. What had once sounded poetic now took on a deeper, darker meaning. Bishop Keller had been living a double life, one as the revered spiritual guide, and another as a man slowly drowning in the weight of a secret he could never confess. Among the documents recovered from the hidden chapel was a folded parchment sealed with wax, addressed simply to the one who finds this. When opened, it revealed a single page, short, precise, and chilling. The letter read, "What is hidden will rise. What is denied will return. The crown does not belong to those who ascend, but to those who descend with open eyes." Investigators and theologians debated its meaning, but Father Matthias, now increasingly seen as Keller's last confidant, offered his interpretation. He believed salvation wasn't in rising above guilt, but in sinking into it, fully, willingly, until it cleansed him. Attention turned again to the river, which now seemed less a location and more a living symbol in the unfolding mystery. Local divers, driven by the growing obsession to uncover every thread, began searching areas farther downstream. On the seventh day, they found something, a submerged, rusted crucifix over 2 meters tall, embedded in the riverbed beneath a weeping willow tree. At its base, entwined in roots, lay a bundle of cloth wrapped tightly around what looked like pages, too fragile to move immediately. The team worked overnight to preserve it. When restored, the pages revealed liturgical texts unlike any found in mainstream Catholic doctrine. Prayers for the lost shepherd, rituals of absolution by immersion, and a final passage invoking the gate of waters. It was unlike anything the modern church acknowledged, yet it bore official seals dating back centuries. Had Keller rediscovered a forgotten rite? Had he attempted to perform it in secret? And if so, had he succeeded? Theories swirled like eddies in the river, but answers remained elusive. What did seem certain now was that Keller's disappearance had not been random, nor was an accident. It was part of something intentional, perhaps ancient, perhaps forbidden. Each artifact recovered, each passage translated, each memory unearthed added to a narrative far greater than the town had ever imagined. Yet for every question that found a whisper of an answer, new shadows formed. Because if Keller had chosen to disappear into the river as an act of redemption, someone, or something, had chosen to send part of him back. The pressure surrounding the investigation reached a boiling point as more eyes, both secular and spiritual, turned toward the town. Media coverage exploded. Documentaries were proposed. The Vatican remained conspicuously silent. Those sources confirmed that representatives had quietly arrived, observing from a distance. Every artifact was now under strict custody, with rotating scholars poring over each symbol, thread, and syllable. But amidst the noise, a new voice emerged. Sister Elvira, the last living nun from Keller's original parish, now well in her 90s and long believed to be senile. Elvira requested to speak privately with Father Matthias. What she revealed stunned him. She claimed that, in the final week before his disappearance, Keller had confessed something that chilled her soul. "The river sings now. At night, I hear his voice in it." Elvira believed that Keller had been hearing his brother, or perhaps a manifestation of his guilt, calling from the water. More disturbingly, she recounted a moment when Keller asked her to bless him not with holy water, but with river water. He said he needed to be seen by the river, she whispered. That only then would the gate open. Encouraged by her words, researchers reviewed satellite imagery of the river's shape and flow. Anomaly was detected, an unnatural curve near the bend where the crucifix had been found, forming what resembled an eye when viewed from above. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others felt it was a signature, one not made by man. But the most compelling piece came from an old photograph tucked behind the chapel altar, a photo of young Adrian Keller, no more than 12, standing beside the river. He was not alone. Next to him stood a boy identical in age, with a hand over Keller's shoulder and a distant look in his eyes. No name was written on the back, but in the corner, faintly visible under black light, were the Latin words, Et iterum videbimus, and we shall see again. The photo, analyzed digitally, revealed more than its surface. Hidden within the shadows was the blurred outline of a third figure, tall, robed, indistinct, standing by the edge of the water, as if waiting. The discovery shook the team to its core. What had once been thought of as Keller's personal torment now appeared connected to something larger, something that transcended memory or metaphor. One of the youngest linguists involved in the investigation summed up what many feared but wouldn't say aloud. This isn't about a man who disappeared. This is about a door that was opened. A door Keller had walked through, knowingly, perhaps willingly, and a door that, for reasons no one yet understood, had not closed. The river had returned the Mitre, yes, but what else had it kept? Or worse, what was it still waiting to return? As speculation deepened, so too did the sense that something unseen was unfolding beneath the surface of both river and revelation. The atmosphere in the town shifted, subtle at first, but undeniable. Animals refused to drink from the river. Locals spoke of unsettling dreams, of whispers drifting through open windows at night. Bells in the chapel rang without wind. And always, the same phrase returned, "The gate is not closed." It was found again, etched faintly into the back of the scorched mitre, barely visible, yet undeniably present, written in Keller's own hand. Investigators, now emotionally entangled with the case, became increasingly affected by their work. Father Matthias reported vivid dreams of walking barefoot into the river and seeing the bishop's silhouette standing beneath the surface, eyes open, hand extended, not in warning, but in invitation. He wasn't alone. Others began to report similar visions. People who had never met, scholars from different countries, began writing identical phrases in their research notes. Not lost, not drowned, transformed. Theories range from psychological transference to spiritual interference, but the pattern was too exact to dismiss. Seeking clarity, a delegation was formed to return to the ruins of the hidden chapel for a full excavation. Beneath the altar, they found a second chamber, sealed by stone, but marked with the same eye symbol from the satellite images. Inside, resting upon a pedestal of black granite, was a chalice. But not just any chalice. This one matched the description from a long-lost monastic manuscript referencing the cup of consequence, an object believed to hold the burden of a broken vow. Surrounding it were bones, small, fragile, almost certainly belonging to a child. And beside them, folded neatly, a piece of red cloth with golden embroidery, Adveniat Veritas. Let the truth come. News of the child's bones was kept quiet, though internally it shattered many on the team. It added a devastating weight to the bishop's testimony. It was no longer just about guilt. It was about loss, irreversible and literal. Forensic testing began immediately, and while they waited, Father Matthias took it upon himself to revisit the river once more, this time at night. Witnesses say he stood waist-deep in the current for nearly an hour, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. When he returned, he said nothing, only that he had heard the river speak again, and that this time, it wasn't Keller's voice. Meanwhile, the recovered text began to connect dots no one expected. Hidden in the margins of the bishop's liturgical journal were numerical notations, coordinates. They led not to the river, but to a bell tower deep within the mountains, part of a monastery long abandoned and buried by snow. Records showed Keller had visited it once in his youth, briefly and without explanation. What did he find there? And why had he left its coordinates hidden, as though saving them for someone to find only after he was gone? With this discovery, the story was no longer confined to one town. The journey had widened, and the search was far from over. The monastery in the mountains was a forgotten relic of a different age, accessible only by a narrow road barely clinging to the cliffs. Snowfall was early that year, blanketing the region in silence and stillness. Yet the expedition pressed on. Historians, priests, and 2 members of the investigative team who had become convinced that this isolated ruin held the missing key. When they arrived, the sight was haunting. A lone bell tower piercing the gray sky, flanked by crumbled stone walls and doors long swallowed by frost. But as they approached the chapel interior, The team felt an almost unnatural warmth. Inside, the air was still, waiting. On the eastern wall of the chapel, behind a veil of ice, they uncovered a mural, faded but unmistakable. It depicted a bishop standing beside a boy at a riverbank, with a luminous gate of water before them. And behind the gate, faintly sketched, a third figure robed in shadow, arms open. This image had never been documented in any known liturgical art, yet it mirrored Keller's visions and the dreams described by so many involved in the case. Below the mural, carved directly into the stone, was a phrase in Old Latin: "What is buried in silence cries out in light." The interior of the monastery was filled with relics: candles never melted, scrolls that crumbled upon touch, and a wooden cross half-burned but untouched by any surrounding fire. But it was the chapel's crypt that revealed the most startling find. Hidden behind a false wall, they discover a room untouched for what appeared to be centuries. At its center was a large wooden table covered in parchment maps, letters, and symbols that matched those found in Keller's journal. And among the papers, a photograph, remarkably preserved. It was Keller, older than in any known picture. His eyes were different, wiser, weary, as though he had returned from something no one else had survived. Next to the photo was a sheet written entirely in his handwriting. Its message was brief: "If you have come this far, you must now choose. Return and forget, or stay and see." Beneath it, a line in red ink repeated 3 times: "The river flows both ways." This phrase, later interpreted by scholars as a metaphor for time, memory, or perhaps even death itself, haunted the team as they made their way back. What had Keller seen? What had he understood in this place that no one else could? When they returned to the town, the forensic report on the bones had arrived. The child's identity was confirmed: Matthias Keller, Adrian's twin brother. The loss wasn't just spiritual, it was personal, rooted in blood, bound by silence. The community reeled. The bishop had not only witnessed his brother's disappearance, he had watched it happen, done nothing, and carried that silence like a cross. Everything that followed, his ministry, his sermons, his disappearance, was his penance. But even now, as more truths came to light, one final question remained. If the river gave back the Mitre, what else did it take in return? The confirmation of Matthias Keller's identity rewrote everything the town thought it knew about its bishop. This wasn't just a tale of spiritual mystery. It was now deeply human, marked by trauma, silence, and the unbearable burden of watching someone you love vanish without justice. And yet, the deeper the team dove into Adrian's life, the less certain they became that justice, in any worldly sense, had ever been the bishop's goal. His path was not one of vengeance or closure, but of atonement. Each artifact, each phrase, each hidden location painted the image of a man trying not to escape, but to reconcile. And still, the question echoed like a psalm in a cathedral. Why now? Why had the Mitre reappeared after exactly 20 years? Why had the river chosen this moment to yield its secret? And more chilling, why had the dreams, the visions, the voices intensified in the hearts of those involved? One investigator, a secular anthropologist from Vienna, who had remained skeptical throughout the process, abruptly abandoned the project. Her final message simply read, "The story is not waiting to be uncovered. It's waiting to be finished." She never gave another interview. As the town tried to return to routine, events only grew more surreal. A priest visiting from Rome collapsed during morning mass after reciting a passage from Keller's journal aloud. His final words before fainting were reportedly, "He stand at the gate." A young boy in the village, mute since birth, suddenly began to speak after walking alone by the river at dawn. When asked what he had seen, he replied, "The man in white said he forgave me." And on the night of the bishop's birthday, the chapel bells rang 13 times at midnight, though no one was inside, and no bell rope had been touched. Desperate for clarity, Father Matthias turned back to the source, the original audio tapes. One tape, previously thought to be blank, revealed a faint background hum when amplified. Then, the faint rhythm of dripping water. And finally, a voice, barely more than a breath. "The gate is open. The mirror sees." Linguists confirmed it was Keller's voice. But the voice sounded older, deeper, almost as though recorded through something not mechanical, but natural, organic, as though the river itself had remembered the moment and was playing it back. The concept of mirrored memory became the team's next obsession. If Keller had somehow discovered that the river was not just a physical space, but a keeper of history, a veil between seen and unseen, then his disappearance was not escape, but submission. The mirror, in this sense, was the judgment he had sought, not by man, but by the eternal. Not death as we understand it, but reflection so deep that it transforms. And perhaps the river, having judged, had returned not just the Mitre, but a warning, a reminder, a call. Tensions escalated when Father Matthias announced he would reenact the original procession, following Keller's exact path to the riverbank, at the same hour, on the same date, 21 years to the day after the bishop vanished. His decision was met with alarm by church authorities and wonder by the townspeople, who felt both awe and dread at what might happen. Was this a spiritual tribute, a reenactment, or an invitation to forces no one fully understood? Still, Matthias insisted. If he crossed into something, he said, then so must I, or the message dies in silence. The procession began at twilight. Hundreds gathered, candles in hand, walking the same cobblestone road where Keller had once walked. No relics were carried, no incense burned. Only silence and memory guided them. Matthias wore simple robes, and on his head, not Keller's mitre, but a crown of woven river reeds, symbolic, humble, unfinished. As he approached the old stone bridge, he paused, just as Keller had. The sun dipped below the horizon. Time stood still. Some say they saw shadows shift unnaturally around the trees. Others swear the water stopped flowing for a moment. And then, he stepped forward. No one saw him fall. No splash was heard. He was simply there. And then he wasn't. Cries erupted. Some rushed forward. Others dropped to their knees. But before panic could take full hold, a sound rose, not from the crowd, but from the river itself. A harmonic note, soft and low, resonated like a vibration through the stones beneath their feet. And slowly, gently, the water began to ripple outward, as though something had touched it from below. Minutes passed in breathless stillness. And then, from the reeds, an object surfaced. It wasn't a body. It was a book, bound in river moss, dripping but perfectly intact. On its cover, a single line carved into wet leather. Matthias, the mirror accepts. Inside, when carefully dried and opened later by scholars, was a single page, blank except for the imprint of a hand, one marked with the faint outline of a cross in the center of the palm. The print matched neither Matthias nor Keller. It matched no one in the town registry. But the pressure, the size, and the pattern were consistent with a 12-year-old boy. A silence fell over the community once more, deeper than before, but not fearful, reverent. Something had completed, or begun again. The river no longer seemed restless. The bells no longer rang without cause. And yet, the people could not stop asking, if the mirror has accepted, what has it now seen? And what will it show us next? In the days following Father Matthias's disappearance, the atmosphere in town shifted from anxious expectation to a sacred quiet. There were no more unexplained visions, no more dreams whispered between locals. Even the river, once seen as a place of fear and mystery, now flowed with a strange serenity, as if the ritual had brought it peace. But for the investigation team, now fractured by loss, awe, and disbelief, peace remained elusive. The river had claimed another man of God, yet had returned something else in exchange, a book bearing a boy's invisible hand. A new question formed in every whispered conversation. Had Matthias truly been taken, or had he arrived? The pages of the recovered book were blank, at least in the traditional sense. But under blacklight, words began to appear slowly, as though time itself had to remember them. Not sentences, not coherent thoughts, but fragmented phrases. He stood where the shadow drank light. The gate watches. Do not enter alone. He was not afraid. The writing style was different from Keller's or Matthias's. Linguists posited that these weren't words written by a person, but impressions left by a presence, like echoes embedded into the fibers of the parchment. The idea was dismissed by some as mystical nonsense, but not by everyone. One of the younger researchers, a woman named Clara, began to spend nights by the river, reading Keller's sermons aloud in the dark. Not for show, not for attention, but out of what she called a sense of listening. One night, after reciting the bishop's 1968 homily on truth as a double-edged mirror, she claimed she heard a child's voice behind her. Not playful, not frightened, calm. It said only, "You see now." She turned. No one was there. But in the morning, the riverbank was covered in white lilies, blooming out of season. The townspeople began leaving candles and letters at that very spot. Something was beginning again. Meanwhile, digital enhancement of the bell tower photograph found at the monastery revealed something new. In the reflection of Keller's eyes, magnified and clarified, was a familiar image, the riverside crucifix, partially buried, long before its rediscovery. It wasn't possible. The photo predated the team's expedition by decades. Yet there it was, unmistakable. The implication was impossible to ignore. Keller had seen what hadn't happened yet. Or had he remembered what was yet to come? Theories of temporal loops, divine foresight, and spiritual recursion now entered the conversation. A theologian from Barcelona introduced a new hypothesis based on ancient Christian mysticism, anamnesis divina, the belief that divine memory precedes and shapes linear time. In this view, Keller's actions weren't prophecy or coincidence. They were alignment. His mitre, his journal, his rituals, they weren't reactions to trauma, but preparations for something that had always been destined to occur. The river wasn't a passage because Keller made it so. It had always been a passage, waiting for someone to see it. And now not one, but two had crossed. With each new layer, the line between history and legend blurred. The church, which had initially tried to contain the narrative, now faced a dilemma. The case had become too complex, too global, too sacred to suppress. Pilgrims began arriving, quietly, reverently, seeking not spectacle but understanding. Some stood silently by the water for hours. Others read from Keller's journals, offering prayers not for answers, but for sight. For the first time in years, the town's chapel overflowed with people, not out of obligation, but longing. A collective hunger to believe that something holy had happened in their midst. But not all were convinced. Skeptics argue the events were a psychological construct, a narrative shaped by collective grief, coincidence, and the powerful pull of mystery. One investigative journalist arrived intending to debunk everything. She left 4 days later, refusing to write a word. Her only public statement: some truths are not designed to be handled, only witnessed. Her silence spoke louder than any article. And in that silence, the people continued to gather. Then came the final signal, if it could be called that. On the 21st day after Matthias's disappearance, the chapel bells rang again. 13 times. The same count from the night Keller had been mourned. But this time, the ringing was not random. It followed a pattern, slow, deliberate, with a pause between the 9th and 10th toll. Acousticians analyzed the audio, and one noticed that the echoing intervals formed a mathematical pattern, one known as the divine ratio, a sequence used in sacred geometry, and also in the construction of the old chapel. When the pattern was mapped onto the floor plan of the ruined mountain monastery, it led to a location previously dismissed, a broken alcove near the choir loft. Digging there revealed an underground passage, sealed for centuries. At its end, a small chamber, carved entirely from stone, bearing a single object, a water basin. Empty, but smooth with wear. Above it, a Latin phrase carved into the ceiling, Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light shines in the darkness. The discovery reignited every question thought buried. If Keller and Matthias had both found their way to this chamber, at separate times, under separate circumstances, what did they see? What did they find? More importantly, was this the gate? The gate the river guarded? And if so, how many others had walked through in silence, never to return? Or, just maybe, returning in ways we were never taught to recognize? The chamber beneath the monastery, with its smooth basin and inscribed ceiling, became the focal point of all inquiry. Scholars, mystics, and clergy gathered in hushed collaboration, drawn not only by faith but by the undeniable presence the place seemed to hold. When water from the river was poured into the basin, something unexpected occurred. The surface did not ripple, not even under wind, not even when touched. It remained perfectly still, like a mirror made of memory, not matter. Some theorized it was merely geological, an effect of the stone's composition. Others, however, saw something far more profound. One researcher, a blind man named Elias who specialized in sonic resonance, stood beside the basin and began humming softly, a chant based on a centuries-old hymn attributed to Saint Eustace. As his tone deepened, the water changed color, not visibly, but to the ear. The frequency in the chamber shifted. Recordings of the event later showed anomalies in audio waves, almost like layered voices underneath Elias's song. When played backward, linguists swore they could hear fragments of Keller's last sermon. Only through surrender may the soul be seen. Yet no one present had spoken. And then, on the 22nd day after Matthias's vanishing, the river receded. Not dried, not diverted, just pulled back, as though the earth had inhaled, exposing stones and tree roots long hidden. In its retreat, something gleamed in the mud. A ring. Gold, engraved with initials. M.K. Matthias Keller. It was confirmed to be his ordination ring, missing since the procession. And beside it, perfectly preserved in the mud, a child's sandal, identical to those worn in a century-old portrait found in the monastery's archive. The image? Twin boys beside the river, standing before a cloaked figure in the mist. That portrait was previously dismissed as allegorical, artistic myth, not documentation. Now it stood as prophecy, or record. It bore no artist's name, no date, no signature, only a name scratched faintly into the wooden frame's back, speculum, Latin for mirror, and with it, another etched phrase: what we send into the water will not come back unchanged. The townspeople now gathered not only by the river, but by the chapel steps each evening, lighting candles in silence. It was no longer mourning. It was witnessing. Still, a final unease lingered beneath the reverence. If the river had returned the ring, had it kept the hand? And if the gate had accepted Matthias, what had it demanded in return? Every offering made to the river since, the lilies, the candles, even whispered prayers, was not just a plea for peace. It was a question, quiet but insistent. What now? Because the water was no longer just a place of loss or redemption. It had become an altar. And altars, as history knows too well, are rarely satisfied forever. The church could no longer remain silent. On the 30th day, under heavy pressure and rising international interest, the Vatican dispatched Cardinal Bellini, a scholar known both for his deep theological training and for his role in previous paranormal inquiries across Europe. His arrival stirred the town into both hope and guarded fear. Would he affirm the sacredness of what had happened, or shut it down under doctrine? Bellini wasted no time. He asked no cameras, gave no statements, and requested 3 things: access to the hidden chapel, the original journal, and silence from all who entered with him. What transpired during his 3 days of private study remains partially veiled, but witnesses report that he emerged visibly shaken, as if having seen something he couldn't fully reconcile. He held no mass. He made no declarations. But before boarding his return flight, he handed a sealed letter to the town's pastor and said only, "Open it when the bells ring again." Not before. The envelope was thick, stamped with the red wax insignia of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It remained locked inside the chapel's reliquary. A week passed, then another, and on the 41st night since Matthias walked into the river, a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Lightning struck the bell tower, but instead of destruction, it activated something ancient. The bells rang out 13 times once more, without breaking, even as the wind howled. When the storm ended, the sky was perfectly clear. It was time. The envelope was opened. Inside was not a decree, not a denial, but a single page, handwritten and unsigned. There are places where the sacred is not bound to time. You are living within one. The letter included a passage from the book of Ezekiel. And the water flowed from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, and wherever the river flows, everything will live. Alongside it, Bellini had drawn a circle intersected by a line and a cross, an ancient symbol associated with the earliest Christian sects believed to have hidden in caves, practicing rites of vision and water. One scholar cross-referenced it with Keller's journal. The same symbol appeared, drawn faintly in the final pages, beneath the words, "I go not to die, but to remember." Now, even the skeptics began to change. Not from belief, perhaps, but from awe. The case had reached beyond explanation, beyond analysis, beyond doctrine. What began as a disappearance was now a revelation, a living parable, a modern gospel written not in ink, but in silence, in water, in sacrifice. And yet, the story did not feel finished. If anything, it had only deepened. Because rivers, as everyone in that town now knew, do not end. They return. They remember. And when they speak, we're the ones who must decide if we're ready to listen. As weeks passed, something extraordinary happened, something no one could have expected. Children in the town began dreaming the same dream. Different homes, different parents, same dream. They described walking through a forest of glass, reaching a river that did not reflect the sky, but memories not their own. And standing at the center of the river, on a stone platform, was a man in white robes holding a child's hand. Some children called him the priest, others the mirror man. But one child, barely 6, said something that unsettled even the most rational minds. He said, "We'll all remember soon." Together, clergy began to take these dreams seriously, not because of panic, but because of pattern. The same childlike drawings began appearing, crude sketches of a river, of robed figures, of circles with crosses in the center. And each time, somewhere in the background, a bell tower, always ringing. Psychologists attributed this to collective suggestion, a byproduct of media coverage and emotional saturation. But those who had been closest to the investigation didn't agree. The drawings matched symbols found in Keller's private writings, symbols he never made public, symbols lost to time. Then came the discovery that turned curiosity into reverence. Deep within the church's foundation, during routine maintenance, workers found a cavity, sealed with stone and mortar, clearly hidden by intent. Inside it was a scroll, preserved in wax linen. It was dated 1872, 100 years before Keller's disappearance. The writing was in Latin, signed by a bishop named Lorenz Older. The message read, "He will return when the mirror cracks. When silence sings and bells mark the wound, follow him to the second river. There, the witness shall rise." No one knew who Older was. No record of him existed in the Vatican's archives. And yet, the handwriting on the scroll matched an annotation found in the margin of Keller's first sermon. How? Why? These questions reignited theories that the river was not bound by time, and that those who passed through it somehow became part of its memory, active, living within its current, outside of chronology. For some, this confirmed that Keller had become something more than a man. Not a ghost, not a saint, but a witness, a keeper of truth across time, guiding others toward their own reckoning. Pilgrimage to the river increased, but the people came not to seek miracles, not anymore. They came to remember, to kneel in silence, to whisper names of loved ones into the water, believing that the river might carry those names to someone who could hear them, even now. And among the visitors, one stood out, a woman in her 80s, who brought a letter she said Keller had written to her 60 years ago. She had never opened it. That night, under the moonlight, she read it aloud beside the reeds. It said only, "You will know when the bells call your name. Until then, stay near the water." The river no longer seemed like a mystery to be solved. It had become a language. And in that language, symbols became grammar, memory became prophecy, and silence was a form of scripture. The town, once known only to a handful of pilgrims and theologians, became sacred ground, not by decree, but by recognition. No billboards, no guided tours, just footsteps on the stone path, just candles by the edge of the water, just voices reciting the same verse that had come to define all that had happened. The river flows both ways. A new figure began to visit the chapel, young, soft-spoken, wearing a coat too large for his frame. He never gave his name, but each day, He would place a folded piece of paper at the altar, bow his head, and leave. The papers were blank, or so they seemed. One morning, after he had gone, a caretaker lit a candle too close to one of the pages. The heat revealed ink. A single sentence, over and over. He gave me back my voice. Beneath it, a signature, M.K., but not Matthias Keller. The handwriting was smaller. It matched that of the mute boy who had begun to speak weeks earlier. The townspeople began calling the boy El Mensajero, the messenger. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words felt weighed, as though passed through layers of time. Once, during evening prayer, he turned to the congregation and whispered, "He is still walking. He hasn't reached the shore yet." And when asked who he meant, the boy said nothing more. But many believed he spoke of Matthias. Others believed it was Keller. A few thought, maybe it was all of them. All the lost, the silent, the unseen, still walking the river's path toward a gate that had no door, only memory. In the forest near the river, a group of children playing stumbled upon something buried in moss. A wooden carving of a man with open arms, hollow eyes, and no mouth. The statue was centuries old, carved with precision, and bore the symbol of the Custodes Veritatis, the guardians of truth. It was brought to the chapel and placed beside Keller's portrait. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The silent figure said enough. His eyes watched, his arms welcomed, and his mouth remained closed, because some truths were not meant to be spoken, only held. Clara, the researcher who had once read sermons to the wind, now took care of the chapel. She no longer called herself a scholar. She no longer sought proof. When asked what she believed, she said softly, "I don't believe. I remember." And when asked what she remembered, she simply pointed to the river and whispered that not all who vanish are lost. Some are finally seen. With each passing season, the town changed, not in appearance, but in spirit. There was a quiet reverence in the way people walked, in the way they spoke near the water's edge. The river had become more than landscape. It was now a presence, a teacher. Pilgrims began calling it Flumen Veritatis, the river of truth. And among those who arrived seeking answers, a few never left. They built small homes on the outskirts, began farming the land, offering what they grew to the chapel. Not in barter, not in tithe, but as remembrance. For those who had crossed, for those still searching. One such man, an aging veteran from Prague, came bearing a cane and a box. The box contained dozens of letters he'd written to a brother who went missing in the 1970s. He sat by the river every morning, reading one aloud. On the 13th morning, he collapsed, peacefully, without pain. In his hand, a note not previously seen. He heard, "I know he did." The town buried him by the chapel wall, under the shade of an olive tree. On his headstone, the river flows both ways. And still, the dreams continued. Not just among children now, but adults too, many who had never spoken of visions before. In their sleep, they walked beneath arches of light, beside trees that glowed like lanterns, across waters that whispered names. Some awoke with tears, others with awe, but all said the same thing: he was there. When asked who, they cannot say. They only described the feeling, a sense of being seen, understood, forgiven, as if the presence they met in their dream didn't just watch them, it remembered them. Father Matthias, though absent in body, became more present than ever. His name returned in journal margins, in the soft prayers of the faithful, in the reflections cast by the water at dusk. Once, a child dropped a white feather into the river. It floated for minutes, unmoved by current, and then slowly spun in place. A breeze came, but the feather didn't move. The child laughed, saying, "He's holding it." It became custom after that. People began leaving feathers instead of candles, because feathers, like truth, were light enough to float, but strong enough to carry the soul. Then came the voice. One night, as Clara locked the chapel doors, she heard it, gentle, like wind through stone, but unmistakably human. "The second river is not far." She turned. No one was there, but on the chapel steps, she found a folded piece of linen. Inside it, a map, drawn in symbols, not roads, arcs, water lines, a triangle intersected by two circles. At the bottom, one phrase, "What the first river reflects, the second remembers. It was unsigned, but the handwriting, it was Keller's. The discovery of the map shifted everything once again. No longer was the river the end of the journey. It was now a beginning. This second river had appeared in Keller's writings once, long ago, dismissed as metaphor. To cross the second river is to leave behind even the self that remembers. But now, it seemed literal. Clara gathered a small group, 3 theologians, 2 locals, and the boy known as O Mensagero. They studied the map in silence. It pointed southeast, away from the chapel, beyond the wooded hills where the land dipped into forgotten valleys. They followed its path at dawn. As they walked, the boy began to hum, not a tune, but a rhythm. He said it wasn't from him. I'm just remembering it. They passed old stones covered in moss, trees bent into arches, and birds that did not flee at their approach. After hours of walking, they reached it, a stream, narrow and unassuming, but flowing upward, defying gravity, moving not toward the sea, but toward the hills. It was impossible, and yet it was real. The stream led them to a clearing where the air felt different, thicker, warmer, though no sun pierced the trees. In the center stood a well, dry, covered by a stone lid. The boy walked directly to it and placed his hand on the center. "This is it," he whispered. "The second river." Clara, trembling, asked how he knew. He smiled. "Because it remembers him." As if on cue, the wind rose. The trees trembled, and somewhere deep below, they all heard it, the unmistakable sound of bells. 13 chimes. Faint, but present. They didn't open the well. They didn't need to. What mattered was not what lay beneath, but what the moment revealed. There was another memory in the earth, another current beneath the surface of all things. And if the river reflected who we had been, then the second river remembered who we were becoming. That night, Clara wrote in her journal, "The second river doesn't carry water. It carries echoes." And for the first time since Matthias vanished, she cried, not from sorrow, but from knowing. The map was returned to the chapel, placed beside Keller's journal. The boy disappeared 2 days later, without a word. But in his place, he left a white feather, on the altar, under the carved hands of the silent wooden statue. Written beneath it, in childlike print, "He's not alone." The feather remained there, unmoved, through storms and wind, as if held by something unseen, as if guarded by memory, as if the river still watched. News of this second river spread quietly, reverently, passed from voice to voice like scripture not meant for print. The town refused media attention. Cameras were turned away. Even pilgrims began to come with less urgency and more humility. They no longer asked for miracles. They brought bread. They sang without instruments. They touched the water not to be healed, but to remember. And always they listened, because that had become the new ritual. Not to speak, not to preach, but to listen. To the wind, to the bells, to the spaces between. Clara now spent most of her days at the chapel. She no longer read Keller's writings out loud. Instead, she wrote beside the river, pages not of doctrine, but of moments, memories. She recorded the dreams others shared, especially the ones where time didn't move forward but unfolded like a spiral. Some saw Keller walking beneath the surface of the water. Others saw Matthias standing beneath trees that bled light. But one dream returned again and again. A boy and a man walking hand in hand toward a gate made not of stone, but of silence. The old chapel's wooden doors, once weathered and rotting, had not been replaced, but had stopped aging. Woodworkers examined them. No sign of mold, no cracks in the grain. The river mist, which should have decayed the structure, seemed instead to preserve it. Even the statue of the silent man, untouched since its arrival, began to reflect a strange light at dusk, soft, silver, like memory caught in motion. Some nights, Clara swore it shifted ever so slightly, its mouth barely parting, never fully open, just enough to suggest breath. Then, on the 77th day after the last procession, something happened no one could explain. A child born deaf walked into the river, just knee-deep, then turned to his mother and spoke his first word, "Home." Medical professionals were stunned. There was no precedent, no explanation. But the boy wasn't confused. He simply smiled, touched his ear, and whispered, He called me. When asked who, he pointed to the sky, then to the water, and said both. His words echoed throughout the town. Some wept. Others simply knelt. The bishop's mitre, once kept under glass in the monastery, was now placed openly on the chapel's altar. No one touched it. No one dared. But many believe that, if one were to listen closely in the chapel alone at midnight, they might hear the sound of footsteps, not on wood, not on stone, but on water. Not a haunting, a return, a reassurance, that even in absence, presence remains, that even in loss, memory leads, and that somewhere, between rivers, someone is still walking, still watching, still waiting for the next to remember. On the 100th day, since the bells rang 13 times, the townspeople gathered without instruction. No one called a meeting. No announcement was made. They simply came, from their homes, from nearby valleys, from distant cities where Keller's name had become legend. And they stood together by the river, at twilight, in silence. No words passed between them. No songs were sung. Yet the presence was unmistakable, thick in the air like incense, weightless and heavy all at once. The river did not ripple. The trees did not sway. And yet, all things felt as though they breathed together. Clara stood at the water's edge, holding the original map to the second river. It had begun to fade, not with age, but with fulfillment, as though the journey it described had been completed, and now wished to rest. She dipped it gently into the water. The ink dissolved instantly, but instead of washing away, the symbols seemed to rise into the air, glimmering briefly before vanishing like ash caught in light. One final phrase remained, written not in ink, but etched into the paper's grain. The gate remembers who knocks. At that moment, the chapel bells rang, not 13 times, but once. Just once. And it was enough. The sound echoed through the valley, deep and low, like a breath exhaled by something eternal. Birds did not fly. Dogs did not bark. Children did not flinch. All simply stood, as if held in the grace of something too large to be seen. And in that silence, a single feather drifted down from the sky, not blown by wind, but falling with purpose. It landed on the water, and it did not sink. Afterward, people left quietly. Some stayed longer, weeping without sorrow. Others embraced strangers, as though remembering them from another life. And as night fell, the chapel remained open. Candles burned. Pages turned in journals. And above it all, the statue of the silent man stood unchanged. Yet, for those who dared to look closely, a detail had shifted. In the folds of his robe, carved so subtly that it could only be seen in the right light, was the outline of a river, two currents, moving in opposite directions, meeting, merging. The townspeople never claimed to understand everything, but they understood enough. That Keller had not vanished, that Matthias had not been lost, that the river had not taken. It had given, it had remembered, and perhaps, in time, it would call again, not with words, not with signs, but with memory. And when it did, they would be ready, not to ask, not to prove, but simply to walk, as those before them had, as those after them surely will, because the river flows both ways, and every soul, one day, returns to be seen. In the months that followed, the town embraced a new rhythm, one guided less by time and more by meaning. The chapel became a place not just of prayer, but of listening. People no longer came to confess. They came to recall. They sat in silence, often for hours, as if waiting for a voice to rise from within. And sometimes it did, not aloud, but through memory, an image, a scent, a name they thought they'd forgotten. The town learned that healing didn't come from understanding what happened. It came from remembering who had been there when it did. Clara began documenting these experiences, not to publish, but to preserve. She called the collection Echoes Beneath the Surface. It wasn't a book, but a wall of hand-pinned notes, drawings, and transcripts from those who had walked beside the river and returned different. Some remembered past lives. Others saw unborn children. One man, who had lost his wife decades before, claimed he heard her laughter in the wind while standing ankle-deep in the stream. He collapsed to his knees, not in grief, but in gratitude. She wasn't gone, he said. She was just ahead of me. The river, too, changed, not in flow or shape, but in behavior. Birds gathered along its banks in pairs, always at dusk. Fireflies hovered, even in winter. And at night, a strange mist would form only over a specific bend, the place where the crucifix had once been found. The mist did not drift. It held its shape, forming what many claimed looked like a gate, arched, hollow, glowing faintly with blue light. Some tried to capture it in photographs. None succeeded. The lens would blur. The image would vanish. But those who saw it with their own eyes never forgot. Then, a new figure came to the chapel. An old monk in tattered robes, walking barefoot despite the frost. He never gave his name. He simply bowed to the statue of the silent man and sat on the stone floor. For 3 days, he didn't eat or drink. On the 4th, he spoke a single line. "I have seen the third river." Clara approached him with trembling hands. "Where?" she asked. The monk looked at her with tired, luminous eyes and answered, "It's not where. It's when." And then he slept. When the morning came, he was gone. Where he had sat, they found a carving in the stone, done by hand, by nail, by patience. A spiral surrounding 2 words, "Still walking." No one knew what it meant, but all felt the truth of it. That the journey Keller began had not ended with him. That Matthias's step into the water was not disappearance. It was invitation. That the boy's handprint in the journal was not an echo, but a signpost. The rivers were not places. They were thresholds, and some had crossed without even leaving. As winter turned to spring, the river bloomed. Not just the banks, but the water itself. Tiny white petals floated atop the surface every morning, never falling from nearby trees. Botanists couldn't explain their origin. They called them Flos Memoria, the flowers of memory. They dissolved by noon. Always. As if meant only for the early risers, for those willing to see without needing to hold. Locals began waking before sunrise, gathering in silent circles along the water's edge, watching as the petals danced, shimmered, and disappeared. It became the town's most sacred hour. During one of these dawn vigils, an old woman named Isabella, who had been mute since childhood, stood from her bench and began to sing. Her voice, unused for decades, was clear, soft, unbroken. She sang no known melody, just a slow, rising hum that matched the rhythm of the river. And as she sang, the flowers circled around her feet in the water, spinning slowly, forming a ring. When she finished, she whispered, "He heard me." It was the first and last thing she ever said. She passed away that night, in her sleep, a smile on her face. Her story spread quickly, not as legend, but as remembrance. The town now spoke less of Keller as a missing bishop or of Matthias as a lost soul. They spoke of both as companions of the current. Their names were spoken not in mourning, but in invitation. Even children knew the rhythm of the bells. Even strangers felt the pull to walk barefoot near the reeds. And still, always, the question whispered in every breeze. What lies beyond the third river? But no one sought to answer it anymore, because now they understood it wasn't for knowing. It was for walking toward. Clara, growing older now, began preparing the chapel's interior for a new phase. Not renovation, transformation. She replaced the pews with cushions, removed the pulpit, added mirrors along the back wall, not to see faces, but to reflect candlelight. She called it the room of return. Inside, people sat in silence, watching the flickering glow and listening to the sound of flowing water piped in from the river. Some meditated, some cried, all left changed. One day, a child who had never spoken a word before walked into the chapel, looked directly at Clara, and said, "The mirror is open." She didn't ask what he meant. She simply took his hand, and together, they walked to the river, just as Keller and Matthias had done so many years ago. Not to leave, not to find, but to remember. Because now, they knew, the river didn't just hold truth. It held time. And somewhere, between its flow and its stillness, someone was always waiting to be seen. Summer brought warmth to the valley, but the river's water remained cool, as if untouched by the seasons. Clara continued her quiet stewardship of the chapel, now joined by others who had once been visitors but had chosen to remain. They came not as caretakers of a building, but as witnesses of a rhythm they could no longer ignore. The rituals were simple: silence at sunrise, shared bread at dusk, and always, always, a walk to the river under the stars. Each step felt sacred, not because of doctrine, but because of memory. Because they weren't walking to the water. They were walking with it. One evening, a stranger arrived. He carried no bag, wore no shoes, and spoke in a dialect no one recognized. Yet when he stepped into the chapel, he fell to his knees in tears. No one questioned him. No one asked his name. They simply brought him water from the river and placed a candle in his hand. The next morning, he spoke 3 words in perfect Latin. Ostium apertum est. The gate is open. Then he smiled, stood, and walked out of town toward the hills. He was never seen again. That same night, the bells rang once, just once, and the river glowed. Not brightly, not blinding, but softly, like moonlight breathing beneath the surface. The glow followed the current, tracing a path downstream until it reached the bend where Keller had vanished. And there, just for a moment, it pooled into a perfect circle before dissolving. Witnesses didn't speak for hours. They simply stood, eyes open, hands over their hearts. No one needed to say what they had seen, because all of them knew. Inside the chapel, someone discovered a new carving beneath the altar, one that hadn't been there before. It depicted a tree, its roots stretching down into a river, its branches reaching upward into stars. At the center of the tree was a face. Not Keller, not Matthias, but both, or neither. It was the kind of face one could not describe, only remember, as if it had been waiting behind their eyes all along. Beneath it, in Keller's handwriting, where the river ends, the sky begins. After that night, time in the town no longer felt linear. People began referring to events not by date, but by river signs, the night of the single bell, the morning of the white mist, the feather that did not fall. And through it all, the water remained, flowing, remembering, reflecting. A mirror that never cracked, because it was never made of glass. It was made of grace. Autumn brought with it a quiet turning, not of endings, but of deepening. The trees along the river turned gold and red, their reflections painting the surface with the colors of memory. On one particularly crisp morning, a young girl approached the water, carrying a notebook. She had written letters to someone she never met, Keller. She placed a notebook on the river's edge and whispered, "I'm ready." The wind picked up, and as she turned away, the notebook lifted into the air, its pages scattering across the water. But none sank. They floated, forming a circle, then slowly drifting downstream in perfect silence. That afternoon, Clara gathered the townspeople in the chapel. She said nothing at first, just lit a single candle and placed a mirror before it. Then she turned to them and spoke. "The river has always known more than we've been willing to remember. But now, we remember together." One by one, they shared what they had seen, what they had dreamed, what they had felt in the stillness. No judgment, no fear, only remembering. It was the first time in town history that silence had been broken by story, not by noise. A scholar from Lisbon arrived, bringing with him texts written in a forgotten dialect of Latin. He had traced a prophecy to the region, one that spoke of the waters that see and the bells that speak. In one translation, the text warned, "When the 2 rivers align, the voice will walk again." No one knew what that meant, but many believed the alignment was near. That Keller, or what he had become, was drawing close, not to return, but to reveal, to show the face behind the mirror. Then came the night the stars blinked. It happened just once, just after midnight. Every star in the sky seemed to pulse, softly, together. For 3 heartbeats, the heavens dimmed, then brightened. And in that brief pause, someone in the town whispered, "He passed." They didn't explain. No one asked. But the air felt different. Charged. Reverent. It wasn't fear. It was awe. Because if Keller had truly passed through, it meant the gate was not just open. It had been crossed. In the morning, the statue of the silent man had changed. Not visibly, but everyone who looked upon it saw something different. Some saw Keller. Others saw Matthias. A few saw someone they had loved and lost. But all of them, in their own way, saw the same thing, recognition. As if the statue no longer represented silence, but understanding. As if it was no longer watching, but remembering with them. Winter crept in quietly, its arrival marked not by snowfall, but by stillness. The river, though cold, never froze. It moved steadily, like breath through lungs that had never ceased inhaling memory. On the first frost, Clara placed a single white feather on the windowsill of the chapel. It had been Keller's final symbol. It was also the first gift the boy had left behind. She didn't say anything to the others, but when they arrived for morning prayer, they each brought their own feathers, small stones, strands of river grass tied in knots. Offerings not for a man, but for a memory that now lived among them. That day, the bells didn't ring, but something else did. A low tone, like a humming buried in the bones of the earth. No one could identify its source. It came from beneath, not above, from the riverbank, from the stone paths, from within the walls of the chapel itself. The sound was not loud, but it was everywhere. It vibrated in the skin. It hummed in the chest. People described it not as music, but as a reminder of what none could say. But they all wept as it faded. And when it did, the wind whispered through the trees a phrase no one had spoken aloud. The gate sees you too. Later that week, Clara opened Keller's final sermon again, one that had been revisited countless times. But this time, something had changed. A new passage had appeared, written in the margins in Keller's unmistakable hand. We prepare not for death, but for echo. For what is called away shall always call back. The river does not forget its children. The ink was fresh, the paper untouched by time. It had not been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be read. News spread beyond the valley now, not as sensational headlines, but as murmurs in sacred spaces around the world. Monks from Greece, priests from Argentina, a Sufi poet from Morocco, all arrived within days of each other, claiming to have received dreams of the same tree with mirrored roots and stars in its branches. None had met. All drew the same image, and each carried with them the same Latin phrase, written on scraps of cloth or stone, Et videbimus aquas ambulans. And we shall see waters walking. They stayed in the chapel for 3 days and 3 nights, speaking only at dusk, always in whispers. When they left behind scroll. On it, a circle with 2 rivers running opposite directions. In the center, a single footprint. No name, no explanation. But Clara knew. It was Keller's. Or perhaps Matthias's. Or both. Or neither. It was the mark not of a person, but of a passage. A print pressed not into earth, but into time. And wherever that foot had stepped, something sacred had followed. The days grew shorter. The chapel grew quieter. But the river? It began to speak again, not with sound, but with rhythm. Its current, which had always flowed in steady pulses, now shifted subtly in pattern. Those who spent long enough by the water could feel it, the rhythm of breath, the rise and fall of something alive beneath. One elder called it the river's remembering. Another, more poetically, called it the heartbeat of what comes next. On the solstice, the coldest day of the year, a small procession formed, not by instruction, but by instinct. The townspeople walked in silence, barefoot, despite the snow, toward the bend in the river. There, they lit a ring of candles, not to summon, but to honor. A child sang an old hymn, one none of them had taught her. The lyrics had no known source, but all who heard them recognized something in their bones. A memory too old for history, too familiar for invention. The child stopped singing, looked toward the water, and said, "He is almost home." That night, Clara dreamed of the mirror again. Not the physical one in the chapel, but the living one, the river. In her dream, she stood upon its surface, but her reflection was not her own. It was Keller's. Behind him, Matthias. Behind them, countless others, faces half known, half remembered. Some she could name, some she could only feel. And behind them all, a great light. Not blinding, but encompassing. It pulsed like breath. And then Keller spoke. "This is not the end of the river. This is the beginning of your remembering." She woke with tears in her eyes, and when she stepped outside, snow was falling, but only on the fields. The river remained untouched, flowing, open. Beneath the trees, a new carving had appeared, etched not by tool, but by time. It was the face from the chapel statue, but smiling now. Beneath it, return is not backward. Return is becoming. From that moment forward, no one referred to Keller as lost. No one mourned Matthias as a boy taken. They were the first, the ones who crossed, the ones who walked the waters not to escape, but to become the way through. The river was not a mystery anymore. It was a path, and everyone, one day, would follow, not out of fear, but out of longing to remember what had always been waiting beyond the mirror. The new year arrived, not with celebration, but with reverence. The townspeople gathered as they always did, by the river before dawn. No fireworks, no countdown, only breath and silence and candlelight reflected in the still water. Clara, now walking with a cane, stood beside the statue of the silent man. Snow dusted her shoulders like ash from a sacred fire. She spoke only once that night, her voice barely louder than the wind. The gate no longer waits. It watches. And those who heard her understood, this was no longer a place between. It had become a place within. The chapel's floor had begun to change, not in structure, but in feel. Pilgrims said it felt warmer than the air around it. Others claimed it pulsed slightly beneath their feet, like the rhythm of a living heart. Artists from across the world began to arrive, not to perform, but to leave something behind. A sculpture made from river stones, a tapestry woven with water-stained threads, a violin carved with no strings. Each artifact carried the same carved symbol, two rivers crossing, forming an eye. One evening, as the candles were being lit, a man stepped forward holding a large, worn book. He said it had been passed to him by a traveler who never gave his name. Only instructions. Deliver this when the moon turns blue. That night, a rare lunar event had indeed turned the sky pale silver. The book was wrapped in linen, sealed with wax. When opened, its title read, Liber Memoriae Fluvii, the Book of the River's Memory. Inside were pages of dreams recorded by people across centuries, from different continents, different faiths, but all sharing the same symbols, the same river, the same gate. One passage told of a girl in Egypt who dreamt of two brothers walking across water hand in hand. Another described a hermit in Iceland who carved Keller's name into stone 100 years before he was born. One page was left blank, except for a line in the center. The river speaks backwards when it remembers forward. It became clear what had happened in their small town was not unique. It was a thread, a single point in a larger, ancient current. The rivers were everywhere. The mirrors, too. Then came the night of the veiled horizon. The sky, cloudless and clear, refused to show stars. Not a single light above. But the river? It reflected thousands, shimmering, dancing across the surface like constellations remembered by the water alone. Astronomers couldn't explain it. The reflection didn't match any known map of the heavens. It showed stars that had never been charted. When asked what they saw, a boy whispered, "It's where they've gone." And no one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. The town, now known quietly among certain circles as Porta Memoriae, the Gate of Memory, continued its gentle transformation. The chapel no longer kept hours. It remained open at all times, its candles self-lit, its altar always warm. And the statue of the silent man, once immutable, now seemed to shift with the light. Some said his eyes followed the river. Others said his hand had moved, just slightly, pointing not outward but inward, toward the heart, toward the memory each pilgrim carried without realizing. Clara, sensing her time was nearing its horizon, began writing again. Not sermons, not memoirs, but reminders, short lines meant to be scattered like seeds. She hid them under stones, inside tree bark, between pages of abandoned books. One read, "You were there. You just forgot the name of your face." Another, "When the river asked who you were, you answered with silence." That was enough. Her writings were never signed, but everyone knew where they came from. They were Keller's voice, reborn through her. Then, on the night of her final walk to the river, she carried with her no candle, no feather, no words. Only a mirror, the first ever placed in the chapel. She set it upon the water surface, watched it float, and whispered, "Remember me by the way I listened." The mirror did not sink. It drifted gently to the bend, where the current slowed, then stopped entirely. At dawn it was gone. In its place, a circle of feathers arranged around a stone. Carved into the stone, Clara walked both ways. Her absence was felt, but not mourned. The town did not hold a funeral. Instead, Every soul who knew her story walked barefoot to the river and stood in silence. And in that silence, something stirred. The sound of bells, not from the tower, but from beneath. Soft, subtle, and unmistakably joyful. As if the river had welcomed her not as a guest, but as a daughter finally home. From that day forward, a new tradition began. On the last day of every season, people would write down a memory, not of loss, but of becoming. They would fold the paper into a boat, place it on the river, and watch it drift. The boats never collided. They moved in harmony, guided by a current no one could control. And as they vanished around the bend, the people whispered the words that had come to define their town, their lives, and their legacy. The river flows both ways, and so do we. Spring returned, but this time, it did not feel like beginning again. It felt like continuation, like the quiet turning of a sacred page. The river shimmered with a new clarity, its depths revealing not stones or sand, but reflections that didn't match the sky. Some claimed they saw faces, smiling, familiar, ancient. Others saw cities submerged in light, gates shaped like branches, staircases that descended into stars. But no one spoke in fear. The townspeople had long ceased fearing the unknown. Here, the unknown was simply the part of memory they hadn't reached yet. The new guardian of the chapel was a boy, now nearly grown, known once as Mensajero. He spoke little, but when he did, his words felt older than his body. One morning, he stood at the edge of the water, eyes closed, palms open, and whispered, "The mirror is now in the hands." From then on, mirrors were no longer kept on walls. They were given to each visitor as they left, small, round, etched with two rivers crossing. A symbol not of vanity, but of vision, the kind that grows when one finally dares to see. Visitors arrived less for answers, and more to remember their questions. They did not ask what the river was. They asked what they had forgotten. They did not pray for miracles. They asked to be reminded of what they once promised in silence. Some stayed. Some returned to their countries and built altars beside lakes, wells, fountains. The movement was never named, never formalized. It was water flowing through memory, quiet, unseen, unyielding. It spread like breath, like grace. One evening, a girl no older than 10 stood before the statue in the chapel and placed a stone at its feet. Not just any stone, but a fragment of the original crucifix pulled from the river decades ago. How she had found it, no one knew. When asked, she simply said, "He asked for it back." And everyone understood. Some things returned to us, so we could learn to let them go. Others were never meant to stay. They were meant to pass through us. Like light through a mirror, like a river through the soul. That night, the river sang. Not with voice, with motion, with memory. The water moved in spirals, glimmering with light unseen by the sun. And in that motion, every soul gathered by its side felt something shift inside them. Not change, but recollection. They remembered who they were when they first arrived, and who they had been before they forgot, and who they would be after they returned. Not to the world, but to the river within. It happened not as an ending, but as a breath held too long, finally released. One dawn, as the fog lifted from the hills and the chapel doors stood open to the rising light, a final bell rang. Not 13, not 1, but 2, perfectly spaced, echoing each other like voices calling from either side of the gate. And with those 2 tones, something changed, or rather, something aligned. The wind shifted, the trees stilled, and the river, impossibly, rose, just slightly, as if leaning forward to speak. And it did. Not in words, not even in sound, but in presence. Everyone felt it, the knowing, the welcoming, the completion, that the gate had always been here, not behind stone, not across water, but in the act of remembering itself. And that Keller's journey was not unique. It was an invitation for every soul to walk toward the reflection they had always feared to face and find it smiling. The town never closed its chapel. It needed no doors anymore. The statue of the silent man. It was no longer a statue. It had become a mirror. Those who stood before it saw not their faces, but the moment they had most needed to be seen in their lives. Held, forgiven, found. That was the miracle. That was the river. And so, the people continued their walks. They sang softly in the dark. They offered feathers and stones and pages of dreams folded into boats. And when it rained, they did not run for shelter. They turned their faces to the sky and whispered, "He is still walking. We are still remembering." And the river still flows, both ways, because now they understood there was never a disappearance, only a return. There are stories that entertain, and then there are stories that awaken something we didn't know was asleep inside us. The tale of Bishop Keller, of a river that remembers, and of a town that chose to listen rather than forget, is not just a mystery. It is a mirror. It reflects our fears, our longing to be seen, and the eternal question that echoes through every generation. What happens when we are brave enough to cross the invisible line between who we were and who we're meant to become? This was never about a man who vanished. It was about a journey back to memory, a reminder that the sacred is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers from beneath the surface of what we've buried. Sometimes it flows quietly beside us for years, waiting for the moment we stop running and start listening. The river did not take Keller. It carried him home. And in doing so, it opened the path for all of us to ask, what do we need to remember before we can return? The river flows both ways, not only in the story we've told, but in the lives we lead. One current pulls us forward, toward achievement, identity, progress. But the other calls us back, to origin, to forgiveness, to the truths we've left behind. And somewhere between the two, we find balance. Somewhere between forgetting and remembering, we rediscover ourselves, not as we were told to be, but as we truly are when we allow silence to speak. So now, as you sit with the echoes of this story, ask yourself, what gate in your life has always been open, but you were too afraid to see? What memory have you been avoiding that might actually set you free? You don't need a river to guide you, just the willingness to listen to the water within. Because perhaps the most powerful revelation of all is this: we are not lost. We are simply returning. If this journey moved you, take a moment to let it ripple beyond you. Subscribe for more stories that stir the soul. Leave a comment with what this tale awakened in you. And share this video with someone who needs to remember. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the courage to look into the mirror and stay.